In March, we marked the anniversary of the first coronavirus lockdown.
The time has now come for us all to do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
This was a step into the unknown for everyone, and that everyone included football clubs.
All Premier League and English Football League and Women's Super League matches have been postponed until April 3rd at the earliest. Meetings were held this morning in response to the escalating coronavirus pandemic.
With competitive football cancelled and large gatherings banned altogether, things had never looked more precarious for the beautiful game.
At a time where some clubs are already on the brink of financial collapse, will the impact of the virus now put them out of business? What can and will football do to make sure all clubs are protected?
Fast forward a year, and things are starting to look a little more positive. This week, organised games were allowed for the first time in 2021. But is football ever going to be the same again? Will the game continue to command the same sorts of fees? The same audience share? The same financial pull? In this episode, we ask, what has the cost of coronavirus been for football?
They're precarious, but remarkably positive.
Kieran Maguire is a lecturer at the University of Liverpool and one of the hosts of the Price of Football podcast.
We've had nobody disappear from the football family, or however we want to refer to it, apart from Macclesfield Town, and the demise of Macclesfield Town was more to do with incompetent management and the dislike of Macclesfield Town by the EFL than anything to do with COVID.
Speaking about the ongoing discussions about merging the Belgian and Dutch leagues on the Price of Football podcast recently, you suggested that these sorts of creative ways of generating revenue have been accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, counterfactual history is a dangerous game, but what effect do you think that the pandemic has had on the way that football clubs are thinking about finances?
I think it has accelerated the thought processes of club owners who are in football to make money. They've realised that the product is not guaranteed. I mean, nothing is guaranteed in business, but Project Big Picture, European Champions League, changes, Super League, FIFA World Club Cup acceleration, all of these things have come into the public domain over the course of the last 12 months. We were moving towards them anyway, but crisis creates opportunity. And clearly the crisis created by COVID has meant that those owners have seen this as their chance to seize control of the game and reward themselves accordingly in due course.
Now let's talk about the impact in real terms. Last week, business strategist Visible tweeted out, since 2009, Premier League clubs have achieved economic losses of 3.54 billion. Since 2017-18, clubs have achieved economic losses of 1.419 billion. That's 31 balance sheets to date, with an average economic loss of 45.79 million. Their figures show a massive drop between 2018-19 and 2019-20 of around £820 million. How much of this drop is down to coronavirus, would you say?
The revenue drop is totally down to coronavirus. We're recording this on a Monday afternoon, and a couple of hours ago, AFC Bournemouth published their accounts for their last season in the Premier League, and they've just shown a whopping great big loss as well. I know the guys at Visible. I think we have a different view in terms of football finances because they very much take a sort of a capitalist approach of football clubs should be profit maximising, and therefore they use this term economic profit. My view is if you are a ultra high net worth individual, such as Roman Abramovich, Sheikh Mansour, and potentially others as well, Farhad Mashiri and Usmanov probably come into that. The idea of making profits is a non-issue to them, so to impute some arbitrary costs through the clubs is not irrelevant. But I agree with them overall that losses are very substantial. We've only seen 12 clubs publish for 2019-20, and with the exception of Norwich City, who made no effort whatsoever to spend any money whilst they were in the Premier League, and even so, they only just broke even, the losses made by the other clubs have been eye-watering. But if you take a more granular approach, we see that there's three income streams for football clubs. There's matchday revenue, which took a bit of a hit in 2019-20, will take a much bigger hit, clearly, in 2021. But I think the thing that's confused some people is that broadcast revenues are down so much, but the reason for that is actually a technical issue. Most club accounts end on the 31st of May or the 30th of June, and of course there were many fixtures that took place after that date, so the clubs are not allowed to include the broadcast revenue for the last half a dozen games in the Premier League, and also some of the Champions League and Europa League revenues for matches which took place after those dates as well. So we will see quite a considerable bounce back in broadcast revenue streams incomes for 2020-21. I think it's been tougher for clubs further down the pyramid because they are more dependent upon the turnstiles clicking, and we've done remarkably well, and I'm not a party political person or fan, on the back of the use of the furlough scheme, the package which the Premier League did give to the clubs in Leagues 1 and 2, and owner benevolence. So that's where we are at present. Things will get better next season, we hope, but there's no guarantees. And my biggest concern is there is an assumption in the game, and also amongst fans, that we're going to have practically a whole season in 21-22 with full attendances, and that is by no way guaranteed in my view.
And obviously the figures that we're talking about here is simply revenue loss over the course of seasons. On top of the shrinking revenue pot, clubs are going to have to deal with a contracting global economy too. Does this mean that things are about to get worse for clubs?
To a certain extent, yes. We have seen the collapse of the domestic French TV deal. The Bundesliga has sold its broadcasting rights for the next tranche, and those are down by 5%. We've seen in Italy, the rights holder has switched from Sky to DAZN, and the money there is down as well. And all of the Spanish clubs have taken wage cuts because of the way that their finances operate. How long it will take for the discretionary spend of fans in the sense of broadcast subscription packages to return is open to doubt. And of course, there have been mistakes made over the course of the last 12 months. And for me, the most concerning feature was the pay-per-view debacle, which resulted in many fans taking the illegal streaming route, and they'll be wondering to themselves, why should I come back? That could be a substantial change to Premier League finances in the future. We've already seen the Premier League delay making a decision with regards to the next 3-year domestic package, which starts in 2022. Normally, we'd know those numbers by now. So clearly, negotiations are taking place, but the fact that both sets of parties are being very coy does suggest that perhaps the glory days of the 70% increases we saw in both 2014 and 2017 for domestic rights has well and truly gone.
One of the things I'm always really interested in, and doesn't seem to be much talk about, is what does a contracted football market look like? Because it seems to me that it's just the case that most of the money in football passes between teams. And so when you're talking about a reduction in the market, what you're talking about is a reduction of the fees rather than anything else. And so surely everyone takes the same reduction and the market just shrinks in that sense.
I agree to an extent, Jonathan, but what I would say is that we have different clubs with different models. So there are some clubs who make losses on a day-to-day basis, but they have a player trading and development model, which means that they make lots of profits from spotting talent, getting it in the first team for a year or two to showcase it, and then sell it on at a significant profit. So I think Brentford would be a classic example there in the Championship. I think historically Southampton have been very good at that in the Premier League. Whereas other clubs have been seen as destination clubs. Here I'd say Manchester United. Manchester United's player sales, with the exception of Romelu Lukaku, have been very modest in recent years. Therefore, on the back of that, some clubs will have to change more than others. If we take a look at the FIFA Global Transfer Market report, which came out in January, it showed that there was a decrease in the number of transactions by about 5% in 2020, which is understandable because clubs were being cautious in the summer market. But the decrease in the value of player transactions in 2020 was close to 20%. So those individual clubs, but also some leagues, we know that Belgium is an amazing country in terms of the development of players, which then go on to other clubs elsewhere in Europe. Belgian clubs, they'll be suffering on the back of this, although that they are coming up with a potential alternative to their present domestic arrangements. And there are other clubs in Europe which have been very good at selling players at high prices, and I think they will struggle as well. So as always, when there's a change in a business environment, when there's a shock to the system, there will be winners and losers.
Do you think we'll lose many owners from football now that it's perceived that the market is contracting somewhat?
I think it might slow down the desire of people to join the market. We still don't know the small print. In terms of what happens in 2024-25, which to a certain extent is going to be year zero in terms of the future governance and control of the game, if a lot of power is handed across to a relatively small number of clubs who have been historically successful in Europe, it could be that owners of clubs such as Aston Villa, Leeds United, Wolverhampton Wanderers, and I'm here working on the basis that there could be changes of ownership of places such as Newcastle United and West Ham. You can see them being very disappointed because their opportunity to join the top table, which is already very challenging, becomes more improbable. It's that much more difficult to qualify for these competitions, and we're playing with a reduced size Premier League, which will reduce the revenues of 14 clubs and increase the revenues of 6.
A new era of football is coming. The door is open for something like the European Super League.
With all this in mind, how inevitable is a European Super League looking right now?
Well, there's a case for saying we already have a European Super League, and it's called the Champions League, because we've only got to look at the 16 clubs who are in the knockout phase for 2020. They came from 5 countries. We've got 15 out of 16 clubs in 2021 from exactly those 5 leagues. So we already have dominance in Europe from a relatively concentrated few areas. It's really a case of, in terms of where those clubs go next, do they take their ball and go and play with it down their own end of the street by setting up a formal organisation, or do they work alongside UEFA, extracting as many concessions from UEFA as they can in terms of guaranteed revenues? And that's all these clubs are interested in. They want guaranteed qualification and guaranteed revenues. If they can get something close to that from UEFA, then I think we're probably okay till 2030 at least. It looks as if the club owners want to both have the benefits of something close to a Super League, regardless of format, and also the regular revenues they get from a domestic scenario as well. If they do create their own competition, there is a chance, and I think it's a relatively slim one, that other clubs will say, well, thanks, but if you're abandoning us totally on an international basis, on a European basis, then you've got to abandon us on a domestic scene as well. I've lived most of my working life in Manchester and Liverpool, and I can assure you, when I talk to Liverpool and Manchester United fans, they want to be playing Leeds United. They want to be playing Newcastle. These fixtures still mean something for fans. How successful would a European Super League actually be? Because if 2/3 into the season, it's Arsenal versus Wolfsburg and they're 11th and 14th respectively in the Super League, a fan's going to travel to those matches. There's no historical link between the clubs. It becomes more of a tourist attraction than football is at present.
So if the big clubs are trying to consolidate the money at the top of the game, should we be worried about the financial state towards the lower end of the pyramid?
If the larger clubs get what they're looking for, which is the ability to sell their own broadcast rights, and nobody's denying that Real Madrid, Liverpool, Manchester United, Bayern, PSG, Barcelona and co are huge drivers of global interest from broadcasters. It's not just the present system, which is two-tier. The big six clubs in the Premier League, on average, generate £350 million a year more than the other clubs. That gap is going to grow substantially. You're left with a Premier League and its equivalents across Europe, which are meaningless to a certain extent in terms of competitive balance. Since the introduction of financial fair play, which has created a financial gap and reinforced the existing ceilings between clubs. We've seen what's happened in Germany, in Italy. Spain was already there to a large extent. The concentration of trophies in the hands of a smaller and smaller group of clubs isn't actually good for the club's long-term interests. And speaking as a Brighton Hove Albion fan, I know realistically that 12th is a fantastic season for us. Do I want that for the rest of my life and potentially no cup competitions as a nice diversion? Not particularly.
Well, let's move on to talk about some of the specific areas of football finance. Obviously, a huge tranche of income for football comes into the game through television revenue. We've seen the value of broadcast packages dropping recently, and in France we saw the failure of Mediapro to fulfil their obligation altogether. What are your expectations for the broadcast market going forward?
Football is still the most popular sport on a global basis, and from broadcasters' points of view, it's also the one thing which can still deliver in terms of ratings. If you take a look at ratings in the US, for example, 18 out of the top 20 events in 2020 were sporting in nature. So it still has a value. And then it's really a case of, are clubs or is the industry in a position to negotiate those rights with an increasing variety of broadcast partners in such a way that the football industry continues to benefit from its popularity. With the increased fragmentation of broadcast rights, and we've already got issues. Yeah, I'm sure you had similar, or potentially had similar. This is a first world problem. Is tonight's match on Amazon Prime, the BBC, BT Sport, or Sky? Now, that could increase in terms of who gets the rights. If the clubs are going to take in the rights themselves, do you end up having to go and buy 2 or 3 club season tickets in order to see the fixtures you want? And it can get a bit messy, especially once people actually realise just how much it is going to cost them to watch football. Or are people going to say, well, enough is enough, and I'm actually going to reduce my overall consumption of football? So the broadcast market is not going to have the significant growth that it's had historically, but I think the industry will come up with alternatives to the way that we consume the product. It could be a sort of an EasyJet style model where you buy things effectively on a pay-per-view basis. And remember, we have that already. We have EFL iFollow. We have Now TV where you can buy a day pass. Could that be extended so that you can actually buy 15 minutes of a match? Because I'm increasingly being told, and I'm an old bloke, but I do teach people who are considerably younger than myself that they're not necessarily interested in watching a football match for 90 minutes, but they're quite happily watch the last 15 if it's 2-2 or if it's a big match and so on. So we will see changes to the way that broadcast packages are offered, and I think it's up to the people in charge of football, whoever they're going to be. And clearly, from looking at comments from the likes of Ed Woodward recently, where Manchester United's share price jumped on his comment that we look forward to having a greater role in the governance and control of the game. I think we all know what that means. There could be significant winners from changes to the way that broadcasting is divided and it is transmitted to people.
If the broadcast revenue pots do contract, where is football going to be getting its income from in the future?
It will still be the 3 sources. I mean, broadcasting, I still think, will be worth around about 60% of total Premier League income. What we've seen historically is that costs follow income. So if income drops by 10 to 15% over the next 5 years, costs, and that's another word for footballer wages, they will drop as well, because every time we've seen increases in the value of TV deals, wages have caught up very quickly. Unfortunately, from players' perspective, the opposite will be true as well. Clubs will restrict the amount of losses they're willing to bear, because every extra pound that goes out in wages is one less pound that's coming through to dividends for the likes of the Glazers at Manchester United. And therefore, I think it will simply be an income-driven relationship. So there has been talk about various uses of technology to give a slightly different product, but as a football consumer, we've been there, haven't we? We've seen the experiment with 3D and Sky. That didn't work. We've seen the introduction of new cameras from new angles. That's fine. I'm not willing to pay any extra for it. So I think in terms of pricing, there is already considerable resistance from fans to spending more money on broadcasting. So if the broadcasters are not willing to pay more, football clubs will just have to go and cut their cost base.
Manchester United have agreed a £235 million deal with technology company TeamViewer to become the club's new shirt sponsor from next season. We understand it's the biggest shirt-only deal in the Premier League and is the largest sponsorship of any kind secured by a sports team during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Obviously, another important revenue stream for football clubs is sponsorships. Do you think that a reduction in the market will lead to a reduction of sponsorship deals as companies are less enticed by the coverage football gets?
Yes, I mean, sponsors are paying for eyeballs. Now, if the football industry can't deliver the eyeballs, I mean, my personal view is that they probably can, but it's just that the eyeballs themselves, we as consumers, will be resistant to price rises. Provided you can still deliver huge numbers, then there will be still interest from commercial partners. Although I think Manchester United very much set the benchmark as far as sponsorship deals are concerned, and their new deal with TeamViewer is worth less than the one it's replacing with Chevrolet. Now, I know Manchester United would also say, well, hold on, Chevrolet were also our automobile partner, but how much of the deal actually related to being the official automobile partner, I'm not so certain about. Again, I don't see necessarily a collapse, but more of a plateau or a gentle slope, slightly up or slightly down, is going to be the position in the market over the course of the next few years. Will there be innovations? Can we see advertisements on pitches as we do in cricket and other sports? That will come about. Will the backs of shirts get more sponsored? If there's a space not being used on a football shirt, I think it will end up being used, and they'll become increasingly like billboards. And then we'll see the broadcasters themselves running adverts during matches and not just at half-time and full-time. I've watched Premier League matches overseas, and that is the norm. It could easily become the norm domestically. So advertising revenues coming through to clubs directly or indirectly, or clubs and their commercial partners starting to use the vast databases that clubs have. If you're on a Manchester United app, then TeamViewer is very interested in your background, because Manchester United have got tens and tens of millions of people on their app. So we are going to move to a data value consumption of sponsorship and commercial arrangements away from the somewhat analog approach that we've had for many, many years, in which the big advertising deal is the front of shirt. I think we will see the advertisers and the commercial partners think outside the box here.
You've talked already about the fact that a loss of revenue will equal a loss of wages, and there'll be a market realignment in that sense. Obviously, one of the biggest questions about a reduced market is also the state of the transfer market as well, which I think for a lot of fans is one of the most important things. Do you think we'll start seeing prices drop in terms of transfer values starting from this summer?
Well, we're already there. Referred earlier to the FIFA report, it was down nearly 20% in 2020, and that was only really kept going by the Premier League itself. And the Premier League, to a certain extent, had extenuating circumstances. Manchester City had cut back on their spending because they knew that there was a chance of a European ban, and Chelsea, of course, had a transfer ban. So the spending by both of those clubs was probably 18 months to 2 years of spending in a single window. The value of transfers will fall. That's discretionary spending. It's a lot easier to deal with than if you've got a player on a 5 or 6 year contract on X thousand pounds per year, because you'll be struggling to find people to take those wages off your payroll. Mesut Ozil was a classic example. in the sense that they're still paying an awful lot of his wages for the rest of this season.
Yeah, as you say there, another effect of this reduction in transfer values is something that we're already seeing, which is players who are too expensive to move in some respects, both in terms of their wage but also the values as well.
OK, some news just into us, and it concerns Lionel Messi. Manchester City have told Sky Sports News no approach has been made for Lionel Messi, despite the forward entering the final 4 months of his contract.
Lionel Messi is a great example of that, with his wages and value being so high that only a private investment fund from a Gulf state could really afford him. Do you think we'll start seeing more of these too expensive players as we start moving over the hill almost, or the plateau sort of drops off a little bit?
Yes, you said 21 is going to be a really tough year. I think 22 will also be tough. And it will only be when those players come to the end of their contracts that we will start to see what the offers are. We've seen that sort of on a microcosm level already in League One and League Two, because players there are on much shorter contracts, normally 1 to 2 years, and it has been noticeable. And I've spoken to people in the game, they've said, well, if I've got a top paid player for a League Two club who's on $3,500 a week, maybe 180 grand a year, we've offered him 130 this year, take it or leave it. And if he wants to leave it, we know that there's 700 players out of contract this summer. Some of those are pretty useful. The balance of power between player and club has clearly changed in terms of contract renewals and recruitment, except at the Premier League level, because the clubs are locked into long-term deals.
And finally, the other revenue stream that has been at the forefront of a lot of conversations since the COVID pandemic began is fan revenue, particularly matchday revenue. On the one hand, it's worth talking about what matchday revenue looks like after the pandemic becomes manageable again. And you've already mentioned how it's not at all clear that we're going to see a return to pre-COVID matchday revenues anytime soon. But I think perhaps the more interesting question is this. If there is a reduction of the football economy, but fan revenue streams remain broadly the same, will that see power handed back to the fans in the longer term as their revenue becomes a bit of a bigger chunk of the market share?
I'm not so certain about that, because half of the clubs in the Premier League have less than 10% of revenue coming through matchday sales. Now, if on average that drops to, say, 7 or 8 clubs instead of 10, I still can't see a significant change in terms of the power of fans. Having said that, I did have a conversation with a chief executive of a Premier League club, and he said the only good thing that has come out of COVID is the realisation by all clubs, and I think it was the case with some, but not necessarily all, is that all clubs now realise that football without fans isn't a cliche, it is a genuine reality, and not just from a financial perspective, but also from the view of the overall product. Watching glorified training sessions, and that's what we're doing, contractually obliged training sessions is what we have manifesting itself as football at present. Isn't in the game's long-term interest in any way, shape or form, because we're all keeping our fingers crossed that fans can return, but it could be that not going to happen for 3 or 4 years. If there's a setback, if there's a new variant, a new mutation, then the clubs have got huge problems, because the broadcasters aren't that keen on the product at present, even though they've got a captive audience. It's the difference between a football stadium as a living, breathing organism in its own right when it's full of fans to being, well, what is it there for? Because you could have Manchester United playing Chelsea on a park pitch if fans weren't able to attend, so the stadium then becomes a bit of an irrelevance.
Well, we began this episode looking a year back into the past. What do you think the situation looks like a year into the future?
If I had any certainty, I'd be an extremely rich man. But I think we will see football's legendary short memories being displayed. I was baffled last summer by the reaction of some fans who, in the middle of the world's biggest health crisis for a century, were moaning about clubs not spending 70 or 80 million pounds on individual players, when surely the sustainability of the game should take priority. If we make progress in terms of COVID, it will be as you were. We will see some platitudes, we will see some moderate reduction in payments for players, but other than that, it will be full steam ahead into this crazy sport in which spending more money on wages than you generate on revenue is, in some divisions, a norm rather than an exception.
Kieran Maguire is a lecturer at Liverpool University and one of the hosts of Price of Football podcast. The music for this episode is provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and the details for the individual songs can be found in the show notes. This episode was produced by myself and Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.